If we can imagine an entirely not-for-profit type of market economy, we can imagine that it would, first of all, have much higher levels of equality because there's no private owners accumulating wealth. There's no distribution of profit to private owners at all. So that cuts off one of the main drivers of inequality in the current economy.
Hello friends, welcome back to another episode of Future Frank TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces.Dreams. I am here today with Dr. Jennifer Hinton. Jen is laughing because she's a doctor in economics, but also a doctor in sustainability science. And she's a senior research fellow at the Schumacher Institute, which is located in Bristol. Jen is located in Stockholm. Welcome to the program, Jen.
Thank you so much, Alicia.
And congratulations on your recent second degree achieved in February. Very well done. Jen is an expert in sustainable economics, and we want to talk today about what sustainable economics is, why it matters, and what the future looks like, of course, all in relation to inequalities. Jen, let me start by asking you about your research on the relation to profit economy, the theory that you developed in your Ph.D. dissertation, and if you could explain to us what is a relation to profit theory, or what does it mean, what does it entail, what is the different perceptions that you could have of this term, and what should we do about it?
Sure. Okay. So to begin with, relationship to profit is a term that I sort of coined in the thesis to describe the difference between for-profit and not-for-profit types of business. And, sometimes this difference is called organizational form or legal form, but as I'll explain in a minute, I think it's important enough to have its own very clear term that this describes the relationship to profit that a business has. And relationship to profit theory is not just about businesses. It's really about how societies relate to profit and how markets relate to profit. We think of a market economy, right? It can be composed, it can have sort of different kinds of businesses in it. They can be composed primarily of for-profit types of business or not-for-profit types of business. Currently, most of us in the world live in for-profit types of economies. And so this difference, I should say, between for-profit and not-for-profit types of business comes down to purpose, ownership, and investment. And so businesses that are for-profit versus not-for-profit will differ in these ways: purpose, ownership, and investment. And so for-profit types of business can legally, and this is again a legal distinction, can have the purpose, like when we start it up, as just pursuing private financial gain for its owners. So it can have a financial gain purpose, whereas not-for-profit businesses only have a social benefit purpose. So they have to have a clear purpose or goal to benefit a larger group of people, a community or society at large, and they have to use all of their resources towards that social benefit mission. Whereas for-profit businesses, they can have private owners and distribute the profit to those private owners. So that's the ownership aspect. Not-for-profit businesses can be thought of as sort of having no owners or having owning themselves in a sense, because none of the profits or the financial surplus or the assets of the business can be privately distributed to owners. So it sounds like it's, an interesting difference on the surface, but when we think of how this scales up, when we think of an entire economy that is primarily for-profit, for instance, like the capitalist economy, has really important dynamics that play out in the system. So if we think of, and the way that I deal with this in developing relationship to profit theory was to use this sort of ideal types. So a conceptual model that simplifies reality, right? Because the economy is so complex, we can't, understand the complexity of all of these dynamics. But we can simplify it to try to understand what are the core dynamics of it. So I first look at, the for-profit economy. What would a market that is composed only of for-profit types of business, so they're seeking financial gain and they can distribute it to their owners, and there's no limits on that. So what sort of dynamics might we expect from that kind of economy? And one of the first things that emerges is that it would grow quite quickly. If all of these businesses are trying to pursue financial gain and they're competing for profit, then we can expect that they would be producing more to try to sell more, to gain more profit. They would advertise and use different sorts of strategies to persuade or even push customers to buy more stuff. And so that has implications for economic growth, but all of that production and sales and consumption also has implications for environmental concerns, right? So that's one part of it, is like the environmental problem and how the pursuit of profit drives environmental problems in a for-profit type of economy. The other part of it relates to inequality, which I'm guessing is why you invited me on this show, because as these businesses in the market are competing for profit, at some point they're expected to distribute some of that profit to their owners, right? That's why the owners invested in these businesses in the first place, the desire for financial gain. So over time, these businesses deliver and distribute profit to the owners. Owners accumulate profit because financial gain is sort of seen as the measure of success and progress in this type of economy. And so as they accumulate wealth, they can reinvest some of it, right? And so there's sort of this reinforcing dynamic where the wealthy owners can accumulate more wealth by investing more in equity or shares of firms, and they get more out. At the same time, this desire for financial gain incentivizes managers to suppress wages, to keep wages as low as possible, because wages are a key cost of doing business, right? So lower wages, higher profit. And so we have this wage suppression sort of dynamic happening at the same time as business owners are accumulating wealth in the system. And so just by thinking about this ideal type of for-profit economy, I came to some really important insights about how the global capitalist economy is driving environmental crises and also inequality crises. And then there's more dynamics in there that I explored, like political, the drive for financial gain incentivizes political capture, which is when, private interests have an undue or disproportional influence on policy making. So you can think of large corporations lobbying against taxes, lobbying for subsidies, lobbying against labor and environmental regulations because it gives them more profit, right? And at the same time, there's also like some market concentration dynamics that are really important for that system. So then on the flip side, if we can imagine an ideal type of economy that is totally not for profit, this kind of gives us a way out of this conundrum. Because we could still have a market economy, we can still have markets, we can still have business, and we can even still have profit. But the relationship to profit has changed, because the profit is no longer seen as an end in itself by not-for-profit businesses. It's seen as a means to satisfy social needs with this core social benefit mission that I mentioned earlier. So if we can imagine an entirely not-for-profit type of market economy, we can imagine that it would, first of all, have much higher levels of equality, because there's no private owners accumulating wealth. There's no distribution of profit to private owners at all. So that cuts off one of the main drivers of inequality in the current economy. And there's no really built-in incentive to suppress wages like there is in the for-profit type of economy. And so now if we zoom back out to like the real world, away from these ideal types of economies, we can see actually that, okay, we do live in a predominantly for-profit economy, but there are not-for-profit elements. There are not-for-profit businesses all over the place. And we researched this a little bit with the Post-Growth Institute several years ago. And we found not-for-profit businesses around the world and in every sector of the economy. And so these are not just your typical nonprofits or NGOs that people are used to thinking about. These are actually businesses that generate most or all of their revenue through the sale of goods and services, like a business, right? So we can sort of imagine transitioning away from the for-profit business structures to not-for-profit business structures, and that would transition us away from not only these really destructive dynamics of the for-profit economy, but away from like capitalism into a totally new era, not-for-profit market economy.
How can we distinguish between non-profit and not-for-profit ways of conducting business or conducting really any activity that we need in our society, so that we don't associate this relation to profit theory with something esoteric, fringe, small NGO scale, not workable on the large scale thing? And I mean, I want to mention also your work on the circular economy and how possibly this could, as you mentioned, affect all parts of business and is not necessarily limited to social business questions.
Yes, absolutely. So when we started this work, I started this work with the Post-Growth Institute back in 2011 or 12. So Donnie McClurkin at the Post-Growth Institute had this idea. He kept bumping into not-for-profit businesses around him in Australia, where he was based at the time. And the sort of eye-opener for him was he was at a conference and there was this company presenting who was a civil engineering company. They were building roads, building bridges, that sort of thing that civil engineering companies do. They had an annual turnover of so-and-so like $1 million per year. It was like double-digit $1 million per year. They were very successful, and they were not for profit. And their core social benefit mission was to help. So they were managed and run by an indigenous group of Aboriginal people in Australia. And so the core social benefit mission of that company was to benefit the community, this indigenous community. And so all of the profit that was earned from the civil engineering work they did went into helping this community gain access to education or healthcare. I forget exactly how specific the mission was, but it was to help this community. So that sort of like breaks this dichotomy that we're used to thinking about. There's like business and then there's nonprofit. But you can't really have a not-for-profit business. So once we started like with that lead-in, looking for not-for-profit businesses actively around the world, we found not-for-profit businesses operating in software. I mean, Mozilla Firefox is a not-for-profit company. And then once you start looking, you start to find them everywhere. Just here in Stockholm, where I'm based, I found not-for-profit cinemas, not-for-profit hotels, not-for-profit food companies, like food manufacturing companies. There's not-for-profit
banks,
farms.
even
Lots of banks, credit unions are not-for-profits. So they're everywhere, but we're just not used to thinking about these as not-for-profits because we just see them as business and assume that they're for-profit. But so that's one step, is like you put on these sort of new glasses or goggles and you can see the world in a different way. When you talked about profit and how we define profit, that's an important point because I didn't clarify that in the beginning. So when I talk about profit, I'm talking about the financial surplus that's left over after a business generates its revenues, pays for its business expenses, including wages and rent and all of the expenses that it might have. And what remains is that financial surplus, and that's the accounting profit. That's what I refer to as profit. And so I don't think that we actually need to change the definition of profit or play with it much, but it's just then, what is the purpose of that financial surplus? What do we do with it? Why did we generate it? And also, how did we generate it? And so those are the more important questions, is sometimes get this idea that money is the root of all evil or profit is the root of all evil. And I push back against that. It's not that money or profit are problematic in themselves. It's our relationship to them. It's why did we generate that money or that profit, and what are we going to do with it? Where the rubber hits the road, so to speak.
So as you say, the important question is what we do with the profit that we generate rather than whether we generate profit or not. Can you talk a little bit more about the alternative options of, let's say, investing this profit or placing it strategically in order to have a better functioning economy, society? Or what is the aim behind, really? What are we looking at?
Yeah, so then it comes down to, sort of like, how do we define social benefit? What is social benefit? And then in technical and legal terms, that's defined differently by different countries. But in general, it's really about identifying social needs. So, if there is poverty, if there's hunger, if there is illness, or homelessness, these sorts of things are social needs that always fit under the social benefit umbrella. Usually environmental missions, so protecting a forest or protecting a species, conserving nature, are considered socially beneficial activities that fit under this umbrella. So then we're really talking about the surplus, the financial surplus that's left over, being reinvested back into fulfilling social needs, into helping people who might be disadvantaged or who are struggling at the time, which is the best way to deal with a surplus. If you think more about like old communities, I don't want to say old, but more traditionally structured economies that still exist in some places. There's like peasant economies or subsistent economies. Those kinds of economies are structured in a way when there is surplus, that surplus is used really wisely to make sure that the whole community is doing well. So it's sort of going back to these more traditional principles and seeing how we can weave those into the fabric of the market economy. So that's, yeah.
Just to clarify, the aim is not to necessarily abolish all business and have a community life and only focus on that. It's a hybrid option, or what is the ideal?
Yeah, the ideal. So that's one of the nice things. So if we can imagine this not-for-profit type of economy, we can also imagine that if the financial surplus is going into meeting needs, the market itself becomes a bit of a safety net, right? So it's not that right now we have this for-profit economy that's causing all of these problems with inequality in the environment and whatnot, access to healthcare and everything else. And so then we have the government is supposed to provide a social safety net to somehow compensate for the messes that the for-profit economy is making. But if we imagine a not-for-profit type of economy that becomes a safety net in itself and then has like a partner government that also is a safety net, then we can imagine that people can afford to work less, to buy less. There's more room in that economy to sort of do more like sharing economies, where we can, communities can have a tool shed, for instance, and we don't all have to buy our own drills to drill holes in our walls when we need to hang something up. Instead, we can go to the community tool shed, and so we have this more sharing-based economy, which frees up a lot of our time and resources to, have more leisure, have more hobbies, that sort of thing, more time connecting with ourselves and with loved ones and nature. So that's the ideal for me, is that, it sort of frees us out of this past dependency that the for-profit economy keeps us in, which is this workshop drop treadmill that some people have called it.
The difference to, let's say, traditional, as in recent economic views of the economy as the leader and every other aspect of life being kind of subordinated to it, is inverted here, right? It's more a systems thinking approach, maybe, where the economy is part of our life, necessary part, but there's other necessary parts as well, and it has to be integrated. And sounds fantastic, and who would not like more leisure and possibility to share, etc. What is the obstacle then? Why are we not living in this more paradise-like world?
That's a really good question, and I think that has a lot to do with so the way that I approach thinking about the economy and sustainability, really, or society, sustainable society, is in institutional terms, and thinking constantly about these two levels of institutions. So like formal institutions, like this legal form of for-profit business, or like certain tax regulations, those kinds of things are formal institutions. But sort of underlying those are informal institutions, which are our norms and beliefs and sort of logics that sort of justify the formal institutions that we have. So there are some structural formal institutions that need to change in order to allow for this transition. For instance, right now, not-for-profit businesses are not playing on a an even playing field with for-profit businesses, because the legal infrastructure in most places is built around the idea that businesses and investment should all be done for profit. And so there's a lot of legal infrastructure built around that needs to change in order to allow not-for-profit businesses to become more prominent. But I think then, we also then, if we want to see those changes at the formal institutional level, we also have to really reconsider our informal institutions, so our beliefs and our social norms about, and that gets into some really deep stuff where, how do we define success? Because right now it's defined in financial terms, right? So successful or developed countries have high GDPs, successful businesses are very profitable, successful individuals have high net worth and prosperity. We have to redefine that. What is rational behavior? Because in the for-profit system, rational behavior is just doing what you can to make as much financial gain as you can. So the formal institutions need to shift, but also these informal beliefs and norms. And I think that there's a lot of hope there, because I think those are already shifting in a really clear way in lots of different spheres of society.
I like that you're very hopeful there. I want to give a less hopeful challenge to your point here. Don't you think that there is a power issue to address here that is maybe difficult to overcome, and possibly, I hope you're right in your hopefulness, maybe in current circumstances this is approaching a little more solidary thinking, but there is a real power unbalance where people that are profiting from the current situation are probably not so happy to change it as other people are that have less power to change it. What would you say there?
No, I think that's a huge problem. And so you're absolutely right. And that's also part of the problem, right? That's part of the for-profit economy, is a handful of people have been able to accumulate wealth and the power that comes with it. And of course, they're the ones benefiting from having the system this way. So they have a vested interest in keeping the system this way. So there's a few ways to think about this. One thing is that, I'll throw it out there and we can be more or less optimistic or pessimistic about this aspect. But I think that a lot of the people, that handful of owners that have all of that wealth and power, I think there are also some mindset shifts maybe happening in those groups, and especially with younger generations who do hear a lot about the inequality and environmental crises. And so some of those mindsets in the powerful hands might be shifting. That's not my main source of optimism, but then I think that if we take this seriously and we say, okay, the for-profit economy is not sustainable, we need to shift in a not-for-profit direction, we're going to have sort of a very coordinated social movement, and I think it has to be sort of a global social movement. And I can see a strong foundation for that already, in the climate change, sort of like Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter. There are so many social movements, Me Too even. All of these social movements have gained a lot of traction in the last few years, and they are, I think, having more and more dialogues with each other, and they're also thinking more and more about the economic aspects of the problems that they're trying to address, because all of them deal with environmental problems and inequality to some degree. So I think there's a lot to be had in sort of, connecting all of these pieces, bringing these social movements together around a shared vision of a transformation. But again,
I like you say transformation. I'd say revolution, but I guess that's
or revolution. Put whatever label on it you want, yeah.
That sounds great. Jen, could you tell us, before we come to a close, a little more about how you became interested in this subject in the first place, and how you came up with this, rather transformative way of seeing and hopefully doing business and life?
Yeah. So I began this journey actually. So it's a long story. I'll try to make it very short. But my first run-in, let's say, with questioning the economic system was when I had just finished my undergrad degree and I moved to China to teach English. I was just kind of hungry for an adventure. I'd studied a bit about China in my undergrad degree, and I ended up in a rural village, and experience. So there I got to experience sustainability crises basically head on for the first time. The government had been moving factories out into the countryside in anticipation of the Beijing Olympics. And so the countryside where I was living suddenly had all of these factories that were, discharging pollution into the air, pollution into the water. Ecosystems nearby were really suffering. The fish were dying off in the river. People were getting sick, all of it. And so it made me really think about, my undergrad degree was international relations, and we had constantly been talking about development this, China's a development miracle. And then I got to experience development firsthand and how polluting it was and how it was sort of tearing parents away from children because parents would go to work in faraway cities and the kids would be taken care of by other people in the community. And so all of this really made me start questioning, what is development? What is the economy for? Why do we need GDP growth? And then did this master's degree in sustainability. Fast forward a little bit, I've fallen in love with a Greek man, my husband, and we are in Greece in 2010. And the economic crash happens. And so then I find myself, having now experienced this in China, learned about sustainability problems in my master's degree, and then experiencing a financial collapse in real time really got me questioning, okay, what can we do to make an economy that works for people and planet rather than people and planet being sacrificed for the economy? And that's really where I started thinking about these things.
That's a fantastic story of experience. In your experience with the subject, researching it and living it, what comes next? Where are we heading?
So there's so many different ways to try to affect change, this kind of change in society. So I'm sort of working with or in dialogue with a few different social movements. I think, like I mentioned before, that's a really important leverage point for change. But I'm also really wanting to use the power of research to make the not-for-profit business sector, the not-for-profit economy that exists today, more visible, and to highlight, how this is maybe an option for transformation. And so I really would like to gather more data about, what are the social and ecological impacts of existing not-for-profit businesses, and what are the kinds of opportunities and barriers they face in acting sustainably. And of course, relationship to profit theory would say most of the barriers that they face come from the for-profit economy itself, and these destructive dynamics of the for-profit market that sort of push everybody to act badly, even some not-for-profit businesses. So I would love to explore some of that and then use the data to really highlight how it is now and how things can be changed for the better.
Jen, that sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. We really hope that you find the solution for these problems, of course, and then you share them with us. Thanks for sharing your insights on what our relation to profit is and what it could be and maybe should be, how we can address the challenges of sustainability crisis, of inequality crises, and financial crises, and loads of health crises, and lots of other crises that we're experiencing currently. Let's move toward a more socially sustainable, environmentally sustainable, just world, and reconsider our relationship to profit. Thanks for sharing your insights with us. Thank you all for watching another episode of Future Frame TV. We hope you enjoyed these conversations. If you do, please subscribe to our channel and join us again if you want next week for another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel. Have a nice afternoon and hopefully see you soon. Bye-bye.